Thank you, Councilman Simperman. It's an honor to have you with us once again, or continually. We appreciate that. A few months ago, last fall, I was listening to NPR, and they were interviewing this guy on the radio who'd written a book about walkable cities. And as he spoke, I thought, man, this guy has something to say. I have no idea who he is, but he sure has something to say about what we're trying to create and work toward here in downtown Cleveland. I think I'd like to read his book. So I went out and I bought his book, another paid purchaser. I should mention, Jeff will be doing a book signing at 1 o'clock today. If you haven't had the chance to read his book, or you brought yours to be signed today, that would be in that room right over there. So I bought this book, and I'm reading it in the nighttime. And I said to my wife, Beth, I can't read this at night. And she said, why not? And I said, because it's getting me too agitated, getting too worked up. And Beth probably said that's probably not such a bad thing for her husband in the evening to be a little worked up. I said, I can't sleep. I can't sleep. This guy has so many good things to say. So I started to research him a little more, and I thought, you know, this is somebody I think who would make a great kickoff speaker for our 5th anniversary for Hope for the City. So I reached out to him. I sent him an email, and I was like amazed. He emailed right back. He's like Councilman Simperman, I guess. He's on that thing. Sleepless, yeah, he's young children as well. Jeff graciously agreed, and we're very honored to have him here today. Jeff, as you may see from the bio that we printed for you today, or perhaps you've read online, Jeff is a champion of smart growth and sustainable design. He's the former director of design for the National Council of Arts. He's author of numerous articles and books, including co-author of Suburban Nation, The Rise of Sprawl and the Decline of the American Dream. And he has also written his most recent book, the one that woke me up, called Walkable City, How Downtown Can Save America One Step at a Time. So friends, would you please join me in offering a very warm Old Stone welcome and a very warm Cleveland welcome to the man who wrote the book that kept me awake at night. So, Jeff Speck.
Thank you, Pastor Mark. Wow, I have a lot of introductory things to say. But first, just in response to your comment, it's funny, I was thinking as you said that my book was keeping you up. The book has come out on audible.com, and I'm trying to memorize the book so I can be an even better speaker. And so I have it on tape, and when my kids wake me up at night and I have trouble getting back to sleep, I put it on and it puts me right to sleep. But that's because it's, you know, it's so familiar to me. I'm sure it will agitate you adequately. And the book signing is also a book sale. We should say that for the benefit of the bookstore that came here for that purpose. And I do hope, and I've been amazed how many people have come up to me already who have the book, which makes an author's heart glow. But I do hope if you find this conversation interesting and you want to hear more of it, that you will patronize those folks, and me, I guess, in the hallway afterwards. So thank you so much to the Old Stone Church. Thank you to Mark Giuliano and Beth Giuliano. I call them the Giuliani, which means you could be mayor, I suppose. And the Downtown Residents Association, and then the wonderful tours that I received. First from Steve Litt, who I imagine many of you know, who you may not know. I mean, some of you may have grown up reading Steve Litt. I grew up reading Robert Campbell, who's the Boston Globe's architecture critic. There aren't that many left in the country. But more to the point, there are probably about 8 people I could name on the national scene who are considered the best architecture critics in the country, and Steve Litt is one of them. And he was kind enough to give me a tour this morning. And then the Downtown Cleveland Alliance, and Joe to my left is an encyclopedia of information. I stopped trying to remember what he was telling me after about 3 minutes because there was just too much information. But wonderful tour that I received today. Luckily, most of it in a van because it was just too cold for my, DC is a southern city. I want to acknowledge a couple people in the crowd. Lee, the CEO of CEOs for Cities. Raise your hand, Lee. You probably all know him. This book was written in part because I got a grant through CEOs for Cities. So they had a much larger role in today than you might have imagined. And then Bruce Donnelly, who I've worked with before. You may not know Bruce, but he's someone who's been thinking about these issues for a very long time with Andres Dwani in Miami and other places where I've worked. And I didn't know you lived here, Bruce, but I recognized you immediately, and he's a real resource in your community as well. And then of course, Councilman, thank you. Your enthusiasm is contagious, and I should say between the two of them, the bar has been set very high for public speaking today, and I will try to live up to it. So this is a bunch of firsts for me. This is the first time I've ever spoken in a church. The first time I've ever been introduced by a pastor. A lot of pressure there. It's the first time I've ever been at one of these Elks tables, like from the movie Naked Gun, right? Where he leaves his mic on and goes to the bathroom and then tackles the queen. Right? Isn't it that movie? So that's interesting. I understand it was a necessity to the crowd. Fantastic, but that's a certain amount of pressure. And it's my first time in Cleveland. Can you believe that? And that's the airport counts, because I've been through the airport a couple times. But it's just weird. Like, this is one of the biggest cities in America that I haven't been to. It's like I've never been to Spain either, right? I mean, who knows why these things happen? But, you know, growing up on the East Coast, being aware of urban issues, hearing things that you hear, I had certain impressions about Cleveland. And I should say they weren't fully inaccurate, but I was not prepared for, and this sounds like a lot of BS, but I have to say it's from the depth of my heart, I was not prepared for how beautiful this city is, how beautiful your architecture is, and how potentially beautiful the spaces between those buildings could be, because they're held. So what so many cities lack as they pour so much money into making themselves more walkable and livable is that framework of civic and honorable buildings that give life and dignity and shape to the spaces in the city. And you've got that in you know, you've got a gold mine of that. And so, you know, I have a newfound respect for this city, and I'm delighted to have seen it, and hope to come back and get to know it a little bit better, because my trip here today is quite quick. Wonderful crowd. How many of you walked here? Wow, amazing. So how many took transit, and how many drove? That's incredible. That's really surprising and pleasing to me. A funny thing of how many people biked here? It's tough in the snow. I don't bike in this weather. I bike around DC, but I don't do it. I don't do it in this weather. So this is really interesting. So the book came out. I've been on a book tour. This isn't really part of the book tour. This is a separate thing. But my publisher sent me to Town Hall in Seattle, to Powell's Books in Portland, to the Architectural Association in New York, a couple other places. Very small book tour. And book tours aren't what they used to be, but I said to them, you know, why aren't I going to San Francisco? Why aren't I going to these other places? And they said, well, those places don't really have the venues where these sort of events are successful. And I realized as I was talking in these cities that I was talking exactly to the cities that didn't need to hear me. Portland didn't need to hear me, Seattle didn't need to hear me, New York, Boston, you know, didn't need to hear me. Because it's precisely in those cities which have walkability where you have the sort of culture where events like this are well attended. And not believing it, last week I was in Miami on my way to something else, and I lived in Miami for a decade, from 93 to 03, and I said, you know, I'm going to call up Books and Books, not to give them a hard time, I'm going to call up Books and Books, you see I will, which is the local bookstore in Miami that's well known, and it's a great bookstore. And I've got so many friends in Miami, I was there for a decade, I'm going to have a book talk in Miami. And we set the whole thing up, we advertised it just like any other talk. 7 people came. And 5 of them were old friends. And it was, I wish, you know, at a certain point you look at the crowd, you're like, I want more people to come. At a certain point you look at the crowd as they're filing in, or in this case, file, you know, single, whatever. And you're like, I don't want anyone else to come, because I don't want anyone to see this. Like, I don't want anyone else I know to come in this. You know, and Mayor Diaz, former mayor, texted me and says, I'm late, I'm not going to make it. And I was like, thank goodness you can't see how few people wanted to see me in Miami. Okay. So, point being, you know, Miami is a driving city, and I really believe that Miami is a city that has strong culture in many different ways, and it's a great city in so many ways. But I firmly believe that there's a certain urban framework that encourages people to gather in this way. and you have a certain degree of it here. You could have more, but it's clear that, that maybe this is one of these places where I don't need to speak. So thank you very much. The other first for today is this is the first time I've ever spoken without either slides or my book. And so it's like without a net, I'm a little nervous. The book's there if I need, I can grab it. But I really wanted to just talk about the issues that were in the book to you, and I've done enough of this now where I think I can pull it off. And the, you know, the book is organized into two sections. The first part of the book, which is a little less than half, is why walkability, and why that's so important to the success of our cities. And that's what I'm going to talk to you about today. What I'm not going to talk to you about today at all is how to achieve that. That's the second big half of the book, which is 10 separate chapters, the 10 steps of walkability. And actually we have a more internal session, although I guess it was open to registrants as well, happening after this for a smaller group upstairs. That's 2 hours of how to achieve walkability. But it is all in the book without the pictures that I'll be having this afternoon. But what I want to talk to you about today was why I believe is almost the wrong word, why it's a fact that the future of this region, the future of the Cleveland metropolitan area is really in the blocks that surround us right now today, in the heart of your downtown. And why, for the sake of your city, for its competitiveness, for its health, and God knows this is a health-oriented city, and for its contribution to the sustainability of the region and the country, we need for Cleveland's future to be focused in its heart, in its historic heart, and in its downtown. And it's funny because, you know, I'm a planner. I was trained as an architect. I've always been a design-focused person. It was only through, it kind of happened accidentally that I became drawn into these larger social issues that surround the work that we do. But as I studied architecture, I became interested in this concept called the New Urbanism that was promoted by my mentors, Andres Donnelly and Elizabeth Plater-Zyberg, who I wrote Suburban Nation with out of Miami. And at first they called it neo-traditional town planning. And it was understanding that we just didn't like sprawl. We didn't find it comfortable, they didn't find it comfortable or interesting, or they didn't, the perceptions were that it wasn't robust socially. And it was a return to the traditional ways of making communities. And that kind of grew into this whole thing called the New Urbanism that probably many of you have heard of. Neo-traditional town planning kind of offended the liberals, and New Urbanism offended the conservatives. But now it's come to be talked about as walkability. But what's happened, first of all, in reframing it was kind of an accident. By reframing it in the terms of walkability, as I have with this book and kind of in my practice by accident, I think we've tapped into a much larger vein of people who care about these issues, but who we weren't communicating very effectively with about these issues. But we've also become more aware of the social ramifications and the social aspects of the work that we're doing as designers, and how important design is to the social qualities of our communities. And so, you know, what happened was that makes this work now so much more relevant is that, you know, for several decades, and I say we, but I mean Andres and Liz before me and others and me kind of a second generation, we were shouting into the wilderness about why we loved our older cities, why we loved our downtowns, why sprawl wasn't doing it for us. And we pointed to mostly aesthetic and social reasons. We don't like the way sprawl looks, we don't like the way it feels. We don't believe that it generates as much culture as the traditional neighborhood, be it in a village, a town, or a city. That's about it. That's our argument. And then what's happened in the past 15 years, all of a sudden, and we were planners and designers, and who really listens to them anyway? And what happened in the past 15 years is 3 different groups started raising their own issues, groups of people who are listened to. The economists started saying, actually, cities generate value much better than suburban sprawl. The doctors started saying, cities are much healthier for us than suburban sprawl. And the environmentalists finally, and I'll get to that, started saying cities are better for the environment than suburban sprawl. And I should say this is not a city versus suburb argument. This isn't a downtown Cleveland versus Shaker Heights argument. This is a walkable versus drivable urbanism discussion. So there are plenty of suburbs and smaller towns in your region that are even part of the city even, that still qualify as this walkable downtown type of urbanism. It's really the difference between the lifestyle in which, the best way I have of describing it is, in the place where you choose to live, work, play, is the automobile an instrument of freedom or is the automobile a prosthetic device? Do you need it to live your life effectively? And for 50 years in America, all we have been building is the latter, is places which have the presumption of automobile, individual automobile ownership, individual automobile use from the age of 16 on. And that's the way we built our country that's been harming us in so many ways. And the downtown is the many downtowns of our city are the solution to that. So these are the first 3 chapters of the book, are the economic, the health, and the environmental reasons why A, cities are the future, and B, why we need them to be the future, and C, why you need to live in it for your future, right? So the economic argument is, it's amazing to see who's moving into cities. So I've been brought, or choosing to stay in cities, I've been brought to a lot of cities by CEOs for cities. And CEOs for cities tend to work for the big institutions, sometimes for government, too, but for universities, for big corporations, for the town fathers. And they brought me into Grand Rapids, and the question was, how can Grand Rapids compete against Chicago? How can Grand Rapids compete, frankly, against its own suburbs, right? But the question I was being asked by the philanthropists, the wealthy families in the city, was how can we get our kids to stay here? How can we get our grandkids to stay in Grand Rapids? And half of it is programming, and that's a specialty of CEOs for cities. How large should our stadia be? How big should our convention center be? How do we program? What events do we program? But the reason I was brought in is they understood that half of it is the physical form of the community. If you don't have the right shaped street spaces that generate street life, then certain groups, particularly the millennials, aren't going to want to be there. Most cities want to attract millennials. Millennials are defined as being roughly 25 to 35, or I'd say 20 to 35. You've probably heard some of the statistics about millennials. Car ownership is way down. Interest in home ownership is way down. In the 70s, 1 in 12 19-year-olds opted out of getting a driver's license. Now it's 1 in 4 19-year-olds that don't have driver's license. 64% of millennials decide first where they want to live, then they move there, and then they look for a job. And 77% of them say they want to live in America's urban cores. And you wonder why. But then you think, and this is the economist Chris Leinberger speaking now, and he asked me, Jeff, what TV shows did you watch as a kid? See, I'm almost 50. I grew up watching Gilligan's Island, The Brady Bunch, The Partridge Family, right? Gilligan's Island didn't have much to say about urbanity, but the other two were pure suburban and very kind of pro-suburban, and idealized, Happy Days too, kind of idealized that suburban lifestyle. I did watch some other shows. I watched Mannix, Hawaii Five-0, Dragnet, Streets of San Francisco, focused all on one subject, crime. And then there was like the Honeymooners and Lucille Ball, kind of left over from the 50s, where the city was like this vague sooty presence outside the window, but not a real presence. So what did the millennials grow up watching? Seinfeld, Friends, eventually Sex and the City. And they grew up in the suburbs too, right? So my complacency at being suburban and watching these suburban shows has been replaced by their longing being suburban and watching urban shows. And what's really interesting, when you look at these drops in car ownership, and J.D. Power's association, hardly, anti-car, right? They're the ones who do polling for the car lobby, saying kids are more interested in being connected than having cars right now. And the big surprise to me was, I guess it makes sense. When I was a kid, 50% of us walked to school. These kids, 15% walked to school. So they were being chauffeured around all day long, every day. So why are these kids who are so used to driving not interested in having cars. Well, I guess they're just sick of being in cars. They're sick of being in the back of their parents' cars. And what do they value? They value not having to have a car. They value good transit. They value biking to a tremendous degree. And a city that provides bike facilities isn't just providing bike facilities. You're providing a horizontal billboard throughout your city that says we are a cool, forward-thinking, sustainable city that invites creative talent to our city. Thank you. Thank them. And so this is the group that's moving to your city in droves, or will when you give them more apartments. But they're the second largest cohort right now. The largest cohort, of course, is their parents, the baby boomers, the front-end boomers, 1.5 million of whom are turning 65 every year, 4 times the rate of just a decade ago. They don't need the big house. They don't need the yard. They don't need schools. And the millennials don't need schools either, which is a huge factor. They'll want schools eventually. Then you get the situation you have in more advanced cities like mine, where schools are the biggest problem because the millennials grew up, or I should say the 20-somethings grew up, and now we all have kids and schools are an issue. But it's a problem you want to have. You want to get to that problem, right? But the front-end boomers, they don't need what the suburbs offers them anymore. And what they need is an opportunity to move to a place eventually they can get out of their house, which might be underwater, and that's an issue. But they want to, many of them, not all of them, but a significant portion, want to move to a place where they can age gracefully in place. And where they don't have to re-retire to a home, you know, a retirement home where the definition of freedom is that bus on Wednesday that takes you to the shopping mall, right? They don't want to have to do that the minute they lose their driver's licenses. And so my parents, who are previous generation, you know, they're around 80, and they made the choice to move from our leafy lot in Belmont Hill, Massachusetts, to the center of Lexington, Massachusetts, which is a perfect main street. It's what sociologists started discovering in the 80s called a NORC, a naturally occurring retirement community. And the first one was the Upper East Side of New York. Where just wealthier old people said, I want to live here, and they start buying up the real estate because they realize they can age gracefully in place without having to drive everywhere. So these are groups, the millennials, and the population bubble is amazing like this, you know, and I'm right here, but I mean, these are the 2 big cohorts that have every reason to be in the city and very little reason to be in the suburb. But the things that are drawing them to the city are the things that distinguish the city from the suburbs, and principally that is the walkability. Now, how can I claim that walkability is such a very important factor? It's hard, but thank goodness for WalkScore. Do you guys know about WalkScore.com? Yep. So WalkScore rates every address from unwalkable to, when you get to 50, you're somewhat walkable, and I think everything above 90 is a walker's paradise. And because of WalkScore, a number of economists, Chris Lineberger among them, the Brookings Institution, have been able to map home values and other things against WalkScore. And what they found is this tremendous correlation. And Chris Lineberger separates them into high walkable, I should say, walkable, what he defines as walkable urbanism, and drivable suburbanism. And I love that dash between sub and urban because it's very kind of snobby, right? And he finds very clearly that there's a premium, a great premium for real estate, both residential and commercial, in the walkable areas. How much? In Detroit, it's 40% premium. In Denver, it's 150% premium. In New York, it's a 200% premium. So in New York, you pay 3 times as much per square foot to live in a walkable zone than you do in a drivable zone. And then there's the economist Joe Courtwright out of Portland, who's done at least 2, and sponsored, and in partnership with CEOs for Cities, done 2 tremendous studies, looking at 90,000 different home sales, comparing them, the walk scores. And he found that it varies from about a $500 per point premium to a $3,000 per point premium. But basically, each of those 100 points in the walk score scale is worth, on average, $2,000. And that's the case, for example, in a typical city like Charlotte. So, you know, it's $20,000 if you move just 10 points up the scale in the value of selling your house, but also what people are willing to buy for your house. So here's enough indication that this is what people want, that they're willing to pay so much more for it. But then there's the larger issue of, you know, how healthy is our city economically? And the real lesson there is to look at Portland, Oregon. It's not the only city, but it's probably the best model. Portland, Oregon made a series of decisions in the 80s, well, really starting in the 70s, but into the 80s, that have changed the way that Portlanders live in a notable, marked way. While every other city was building highways, they were building transit and bikeways. While every other city was widening their streets, they instituted a skinny street program. You know, while every other city was growing this undifferentiated tire of, spare tire of sprawl around them, they instituted an urban growth boundary, which, by the way, created a smaller spare tire of sprawl, but still, it was smaller. As a result, Portlanders' vehicle miles traveled, probably the only city in America, vehicle miles traveled peaked in 1996 and has been declining ever since. And the average Portlander drives 20% less than the typical American. So Joe Corwright did this study that's called, with CEOs for cities, called Portland's Green Dividend, and said, well, what does that 20% get us? And by the way, the average commute in Portland now is 4 miles or 11 minutes less than it was in 1996. What does that get us? Well, the money we're simply not spending on automobile transportation is saving them about 1.5% of GNP every year. And then there's a time that those 11 minutes that they're not wasting in traffic, that translates to another 2% of the GDP. So you've got 3.5% of their GDP that was the result of a limited reduction in the amount of commuting that they were doing. So where's all that money going? Well, Portland is reputed to have the most roof racks per capita, the most independent bookstores per capita, the most strip clubs per capita. Forgive me, I'm in a church. Those are all somewhat exaggerations, but Portlanders consume recreation at to a much higher degree than in most other cities. They're the second highest number of restaurants per capita of any big city or mid-sized city in the U.S. Oregonians consume alcohol. They spend more on alcohol than most other states, which could be a good thing or a bad thing, but it makes you glad they're driving less. But most of it goes into housing. And by the way, every dollar you spend on driving, 85 cents of that leaves your local economy and goes somewhere else, a lot of it to the Middle East. Money spent on housing is money spent locally. And a lot of them are spending a lot more money on their housing. And there's even a Portland bike realtor who specializes in selling houses that are well located for biking. And there's a real clear cost, say, price benefit to being in those neighborhoods that are more walkable in Portland, which is many of them. So to talk a little bit more about what they did, I mean, it's amazing. They spent $65 million over 20 years on bicycle infrastructure, which sounds like a lot. Meanwhile, they rebuilt one Cloverleaf for $140 million on their highway. So it's not that much. And that, of course, wasn't the only road project. But that $65 million, people don't know when they look at Portland. They don't know that 25 years ago, people in Portland biked no more than anywhere else in America. And now they bike 15 times as much as everywhere else in America, on average. So it's an 8% mode share, commuting mode share for biking, which is huge in a city. So they've really changed the way they live. But there's the other, so that's kind of the plus side. The negative side now, why cities are so important, is if you look at what's happening in the other kinds of cities. And this phenomenon we have, where driving the typical American used to spend 1/10 of their income on driving. And the typical American now spends 1/5 of their income on transportation. Right? In the 70s, it was 1/10, and now it's 1/5 of your income you spend on getting around. Working families, poorer families, spend even more. And in fact, the typical working family, which is defined, I think, as $15,000 to $30,000 per year, spends more on transportation than on housing. So it's this concept of drive till you qualify. You keep moving further and further and further from the downtown to find a house that's cheap enough that you can get the big house that you want, and meanwhile you're spending much more money on your vehicles. And then of course, when the housing bubble bursts and you're suddenly underwater in your mortgage, and the price of gas goes up, and you're all of a sudden having to pay 50% more at the pump, these are the people who've been hurt the hardest by the current economy, or the more recent economy. So clearly, one solution is to do everything we can to encourage more people to come into the city. But the final kind of economic argument, I'm only a third done. The final economic argument for bringing people to the city is just, I should say, the final economic argument for making your city more walkable is just seeing seeing the experience of cities that make that choice, and places like Portland, which grew 50% in the number of educated 25 to 35-year-olds through the 90s, which was 5 times the rate of anywhere else in the country, because people wanted to be in Portland, because it provided these sort of facilities that were attractive to creative young people. So that's the economics discussion. How long do you want me to talk? Oh, my phone is off. Oh, it's 10 to 1, oh my goodness. Wow. So very quickly, I'm just going to really quickly tell you the other 2 arguments. Do I need to speak it? Do I need to stop at 1? No. People who want to leave at 1 can leave at 1. I know you have appointments and stuff. So the best day to be a city planner in America was August 9th, 2004, when 2 epidemiologists and a city planner, Frump, Frank, and Jackson, Frump and Frank and Jackson came up with this book called Urban Sprawl and Public Health. And what they basically said was that suburban sprawl is killing us, and here's why. And cities will make us live longer, are making us live longer, and here's why. And they pointed to some facts that are really upsetting. You know, it used to be 1 in 10 Americans was obese. Now 1 in 3 Americans is obese. And the second third of our population is classified as overweight. Of course, obesity itself isn't the problem. It's all the diseases that obesity lead to: heart disease, several cancers,
diabetes.
Diabetes, thank you. It was 4 syllables. And the other great diseases out there today. Diabetes consumes 2% of every dollar that we earn in this country. 7% of Americans have diabetes. And this all adds, 1/3 of all children born after the year 2000 will become diabetic, according to the current trends. And you know, our healthcare crisis in America, our healthcare cost crisis, has a lot to do with, you know, the way that we provide medicine, but also just the fact that we're getting less healthy, and that we have the first generation of kids in America now who are expected to live shorter lifespans than their parents. Now, everyone points to diet. And it's true, you know, the whole Michael Pollan argument and our corn syrup-based diet is killing us. You know, there's no doubt that our farm bill, which should be called a food bill, is not a healthy one. But the studies are piling up that are showing that diet is actually less of a factor. Both are important, but diet is less of a factor than inactivity. And then what we've done through, for example, the 50% to 15% shift in the number of kids who walk to school, and the way that we've built all these communities that, you know, many of us grew up in, where you couldn't accomplish anything on foot, and so you had to get into the car. What we've done is we've engineered inactivity into our lives to such a degree that our bodies don't know how to handle it and keep us healthy. So a number of studies have actually contrasted food and activity. One of them was called Gluttony versus Sloth, that was published in England, that documented that people's weight tracked not with their diet, but with their level of activity over several decades. But there have been any number of studies now that look specifically at how our places are designed, the density, the availability of transit, and what that does to your weight. They show that you're going to lose 5 pounds the minute you switch from driving to taking transit. They studied a low walkable and a high walkable neighborhood in San Diego, and found that you were 65% likely to be overweight in the low walkable neighborhood, and only 30% likely to be overweight in the low walkable neighborhood. They studied the whole Boston area suburbs and found this map of weight gain that just got further and further and further from the city, the less healthy people were. And these are serious academic studies that discount for age and wealth and all the other things that correlate with weight. And they prove very clearly that that it's the lack of activity that's the biggest issue. James Levine, a doctor at the Mayo Clinic, put people in electronic underwear and gave them all a steady diet that held their weight properly steady, and then started pumping calories in. Some people gained weight, some people didn't gain weight. And expecting some genetic factor at work, they investigated and found that it was entirely how much the people were moving. So I could go on and on, but the point is that we now understand that we've engineered now that we've engineered the useful walk out of so many of our lives, this is why we're becoming unhealthy. 14 Americans die of asthma every day. Doesn't sound like that much. It's 3 times what it was in the 90s. Did you know that? 3 times the deaths as it was in the 90s. And it's almost all from automobile exhaust. American pollution isn't what it used to be. And most of it's coming from our cars. And most of it's in those cities. You can correlate the worst cities for asthma in America and the highest vehicle miles driven cities in America. And they line right up. Just right there. And then, of course, we don't talk much about it, but all the people we're losing, the millions of Americans, the 3-point-something million Americans who we've lost on the highway through traffic accidents. The biggest killer of Americans under 35 years old. Clearly a health issue. Often forgotten. We tend to naturalize take for granted the fact that it's very dangerous for us to drive around. And on the one hand, we think, well, there's nothing we can do about it. It's just part of being an American, and I'm going to choose to drive. And on the other hand, we say, oh, I don't worry because I'm a safe driver. I can take care of myself on the street. And in fact, 85% of Americans this was a poll, who were in a hospital recovering from accidents they themselves caused, said they were better than average drivers, right? So that's how we feel about our own driving. But we take it for granted. But the fact is that the death rate in America is 14 per 100,000 per year. But the death rate in Germany, with its no speed limit autobahn, is 7 per 100,000. And in England, it's 5 per 100,000. Do you know where it's 3 per 100,000? In New York City, as it is in San Francisco and in Portland. Our walkable cities are the safest places to be. And in fact, New York City has saved more lives in traffic since 9/11 than it lost on 9/11. And if the whole nation shared New York City's traffic death rate, we would save 24,000 lives a year. And it's a function of the way these places are designed. You can map it against density. And it's not just how many miles you drive each day, it's the way these places were built. So a mile driven in South Dakota is 3 times as likely to kill you as a mile driven in Massachusetts. So this is design influencing our health in a dramatic way. And clearly the solution in the short term is to move to the city where you're safer and healthier. The longer term solution is to make our cities more walkable everywhere. And ideally to make our suburbs more walkable, but some of them aren't savable in that way. And then finally, the environmental argument. Scott Bernstein in Chicago at the Center for Neighborhood Technology started making these maps in 2001 that totally changed the way that we think about being an environmentalist. The typical map of carbon emissions in the US for decades, like the one Purdue University's Vulcan project, look like the night sky maps of the country. They map CO2 emitted per square mile. And they're red around the cities and yellow in the suburbs and green in the countryside. City bad, country good. And Scott Bernstein said, well, it's an odd way to measure it. Why aren't we measuring it per household or per capita? And he recalculated it per capita, and the whole map just flipped. And now the lightest footprints for sure are in the city centers. The biggest are in the perimeter. And that's in every city around America. They look the same. They look the same for every city. And there's a wonderful book by David Owen that I quote from a lot in my book. His book's called Green Metropolis. It was going to be called Green Manhattan. And he documents page after page about how Manhattanites use 1/3 of the electricity, burn 1/3 of the oil of other places in America. And it's because they're driving less. There are more subway stops in New York City than there are in all of America's cities combined, other cities' subways. But also because of the way that transit orientation has them living in a walkable and dense way. And of course they're heating and cooling their neighbors instead of heating and cooling the night sky, in their homes. But it's tremendous how environmentalists, the environmentalist movement in America has always been an anti-city movement and an anti-country movement. pro-country movement. Even all the way back to Jefferson, who said, cities are pestilential to the morals, the health, and the liberties of man. If we continue to pile upon ourselves in cities as they do in Europe, we shall become as corrupt as they are in Europe and begin to eat one another as they do there. I guess he had a sense of humor. But that was the beginning, and then the whole Sierra Club as it began, the whole American version of environmentalism has been about preserving the country, and then, let's move out there too so we can enjoy it. Whereas, as Ed Glazer says in his wonderful book, Triumph of the City, he says, we understand differently now. Humans are a destructive species. The best thing you can do for the country and for nature is to move to the heart of the city, and the denser the better, because of what that does to your carbon footprint. When we built our house in Washington, we built a new house. If you go to my website, you can see it. Oh, and that reminds me to send you to my website, jeffspeck.com. But also, please, if you do this, follow me on Twitter. I'm Jeff Speck, AICP, like American Institute of Certified Planners, AICP. I hope you'll follow me on Twitter. Some of you are, and I recognize some faces, actually. But when we built our house in Washington, we did our best to clear the shelves of the sustainability store. We got the solar panels, we got the solar hot water heater, we got the bamboo floors. We have a wood-burning stove that supposedly, when wood burns in our stove, it pollutes less than if you let the log decompose by itself in the forest. So we bought all this stuff. We, of course, got all of these low-energy light bulbs. Well, guess what? Converting your whole house to low-energy light bulbs saves as much energy in a year as moving to a walkable neighborhood saves in a week. And as Witold Rybczynski said, and I'm paraphrasing, it's like sustainability has been sold to Americans as like another version of what can I buy next? What else can I buy to add to what I already have to feel good about myself? And it should be what I'm buying, it's how I'm living. And one of the biggest misdirections is the hybrid and electric car discussion. Because the experience, for example, of owning a Nissan Leaf, which in much of the country is burning coal, if you think about it. In half of America, what you're burning when you're purchasing electricity is coal, which is not a hydrocarbon like oil. It's a carbon. It's worse. It's a pure carbon. So driving a Nissan Leaf 100 miles generates 60 pounds of greenhouse gases. Driving a standard Nissan Altima 100 miles generates about 90 pounds of greenhouse gases. So there's a considerable improvement. Driving a Altima 100 miles costs $14. Driving a Nissan Leaf 100 miles costs $3. So what do you think that does to people's driving habits? Plus the fact they feel so good about themselves driving this green car around. This is not hypothetical. The biggest green cars promotion and buying program, government assisted in the world, was in Sweden. And Sweden now has achieved the highest per capita ownership of hybrid and green cars. And the reports came in, and their greenhouse gas emissions went way up because they're just driving more in response to them. So I like to say that electric cars are the right answer to the wrong question. And the question shouldn't be, how can we make it easier to move around? We've been talking about mobility for years, and thank goodness the discussion switched from automobility to mobility in a multimodal way, trains and buses and bikes. But we need to stop talking about mobility. We've got to start talking about having things close to home and being able to accomplish everything or many things that we need to get done on a daily basis in our own neighborhoods. So those are the three arguments. And the final thing I point to in the I guess it's in the health discussion, is that there are these surveys of most, most happiest cities, most attractive cities. It's the Mercer survey of like best places to live in the world, where like the best an American city ever ranks is about 31. And it's always won by cities, typically a whole bunch of German cities, Swiss cities, but Vancouver does well, Sydney does well. And these are the places that, it's that quality of life ranking. And they rank 10 different things. Education, public space, even climate gets in there. But it's a very attempting to be objective rating of the quality of life of different cities. And there's a lot of stick here in my conversation about why we need to do these things. So let's end by looking at a carrot And the carrot is, wouldn't it be great to have a higher quality of life? And these are the places where people are being drawn. And the higher quality of life cities are burning fractions of the amount of fuel that the lower quality of life cities are burning. So, they drive half as much in New York as they do in the rest of America. They drive half as much in Toronto as they do in New York. They drive half as much in Europe as they do in Toronto. They drive half as much in Hong Kong as they do in Europe. And I say if 10 Torontans wanted to come to New York City and keep their fuel mileage the same, their gas use the same, 9 of them would have to stay home. But the point is, the cities that are consistently ranking highest on these quality of life surveys are also the ones that happen to be the most sustainable, and also the ones that happen to be the most walkable and healthy. So it isn't that being sustainable makes you happy. It's that the things that make you sustainable make you happy. And that's the great argument. People are selling, they're selling sustainability as the way that we have to sacrifice in order to stop the oceans from flooding our country. But it shouldn't be about sacrifice. It's really about creating an environment that allows us to live in the better ways that are making these cities that are more sustainable more popular, and not kowtowing to the same interests that have kept our cities from being that way. So, so that makes me optimistic. We just need to make ourselves happier, and we'll also be healthier and richer and greener. So thank you for your attention. I look forward to seeing you all outside.